Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Attorney Abigail Planky. I'm an attorney with Hooper Law Office. We are primarily a law firm focusing on estate planning and elder law. And then the elder law that we really do is long-term care planning, which is our topic today, stretching every dollar with Medicaid planning. So if you are attending the webinar live today, just know that there is a question and answer feature available for those who are attending live. Feel free to just type your questions in as I go. No need to wait for the end. I'm happy to answer questions as we go through everything. And then also too, if you have any questions, you can also send an email to learnmore@hooperlawoffice.com if you don't want to ask here. But the question and answer feature is awesome. If you have that question, maybe other people have that question too. And if you're watching a recording of this webinar, just know that that question and answer feature is available with all of our live webinars. So to get started on our material for today's topic, you will be sent our Your Life, Your Legacy, Nursing Homes, and Long-Term Care book that goes into more detail about long-term care planning. You will also be sent a feedback form. So I would appreciate your feedback on today's webinar, constructive comments or otherwise. I'd just like to know what you thought. You will also see on that feedback form, there is an opportunity to register for a 2-hour complimentary initial consultation with one of the attorneys from my office. So how that really works is we do have offices in Appleton, Green Bay, and Oshkosh. Our attorneys are happy to meet with you in any office that's most convenient for you. That 2 hours is going to give us a good chance to talk about your goals and needs specifically, come up with a recommendation for what would best suit those. And then we'd always quote that price to complete that planning at that time. So if that 2-hour initial consult is a wonderful thing to get some direct answers on your questions. And again, we can meet Appleton, Green Bay, Oshkosh, whatever works best for you. The biggest thing that I wanted to start off with today is just understanding what is Medicaid, because that's a really common question that I get is I have Medicare or I know what Medicare is. So Medicare is a federal health insurance program that helps to pay for some types of health insurance expenses. And most commonly when we're talking about care, Medicare will pay for a certain amount of days of like rehab. So that way, if you go into a hospital or you're in rehab and it's a short-term stay in that facility, Medicare will pay not completely. The timeline is 100 days. They'll pay for at most 100 days. That doesn't mean that they pay for the full thing for those 100 days. It kind of partitions out there with given where you are in that process. But also in my experience, most people don't typically get that full 100 days. Most people are more in that 20 to rehabilitative care. And then it's kind of that determination of, are you needing to be in the federal program? It's run by each specific state. So if you find information on Medicaid online, just know that you want to look at Wisconsin Medicaid. There are other, Medicaid programs throughout the US. With Medicaid then in Wisconsin, that's who pays for long-term stays in assisted livings or in skilled nursing facilities, CBRFs, that sort of thing. Now, with Medicaid, different from Medicare, there are going to be not only, functional requirements, but income and asset requirements. And what I really want to focus on for today is, again, stretching your dollars by doing Medicaid planning. And where that really comes into play more is not so much that functional or income requirement. We have other classes, explaining those things, but it's those asset requirements. It's those spend downs. So with Medicaid, your asset requirements are going to differ if you're a single person versus if you're a married couple. So starting firstly with married couples, there are certain types of things that don't count. They're non-countable toward the assets you are allowed to have. So your house is a non-countable asset. One vehicle is a non-countable asset. You can set aside some money for burial. You can have a very low amount in life insurance. Otherwise, and then the retirement accounts of the spouse who's at home are non-countable. So the retirement accounts, though, for the spouse who's receiving care, they are countable. So if both spouses are trying to access Medicaid, they both be countable. Otherwise, those other things that I didn't mention, so your banking accounts, your investment accounts, your stocks, your bonds, the retirement accounts of the spouse who's receiving care, all those other things, more than just your home, those are all countable. So as far as what amounts you are allowed to have and access Medicaid is going to be of those countable things, it becomes, just some math. You get to keep at least, the spouse at home gets to keep at least $50,000 of those countable assets, up to $148,000. But that's kind of a half between wherever you fall in those limits. So let's say that you had $200,000 in countable assets. That spouse at home gets to keep $100,000 in countable assets. And this, and for single individuals, that's really kind of simple compared to where the married couple shifting is. With single individuals, you can have that house, that car, money for burial, that low life insurance, but everything else has to be spent below $2,000. So there's a big shift between what you can have asset-wise as that community spouse and spending down to that $2,000 as a single individual. And it's that spend down that can become concerning. So a lot of times people hear these asset values for Medicaid and they're told that your care costs are on you. If you don't have long-term care insurance, if your income is less than your care, those sorts of things, that your long-term care costs are on you until the point that you qualify for Medicaid, until the point that you spend your money down to below those levels. And Medicaid planning is something that we assist with. That's where we look at trying to actually preserve assets from that spend down. And, there are ways to, set money aside into what, doesn't count and other sorts of strategies that you can use. But what I find is most important with long-term care planning is, if we're going to give it an analogy, we want a controlled burn, not a wildfire. So yes, there are ways to just spend and spend and spend money until the point that you qualify for Medicaid, but there are also ways to control that spend down so that way some money can be saved and preserved to supplement your needs, or then to go to your family outside of that estate recovery concern that we hear with Medicaid. So the idea of stretching your dollars with Medicaid planning means that we want to pay something to get you into good quality care, because facilities are going to have what are called private pay requirements. So Medicaid pays less than private pay individuals do. So what that means is for facilities to be good businesses, they have to know for however many people on Medicaid they have this many people privately paying because of that cost difference. So they'll say, yes, you can access Medicaid, but only after, a year or 2 years, or more commonly 3 years. And what you want to do is meet that requirement to that facility. You want to pay the amount of time that you're agreeing to if you're able. That's why you want to know not only how much it is, but how long you need to pay. But that can really provide an opportunity to be able to do some Medicaid planning to preserve normally about 50 to 60% of what you have from being spent down on care. What we would do is kind of align things with that private pay requirement, making sure that we're meeting our obligations to the facility, but we're getting you on Medicaid at that point versus just paying and paying and paying and paying until you're on Medicaid. The concern with purely spending down until you qualify for Medicaid is those numbers are really low. And Medicaid is a great benefit in the fact that it will pay for the facility and your prescriptions and your needs. So Medicaid equalizes care costs for everyone. So if you have, $3,000 a month in income and your facility costs $6,000 a month in income, Medicaid will take your $3,000, you get to keep $45 a month, and they will pay the difference. They would do the same thing if you had $5,999, dollars worth of income. They pay that difference. So, but what Medicaid doesn't pay for are other things, like your cable bill, your Netflix, your phone bill, going out to eat every once in a while, maybe new clothes or getting your hair done. That's the thing that Medicaid doesn't pay for. And oftentimes what happens when people purely spend and spend and spend until they're on Medicaid and they haven't done that other planning is when they have those additional expenses, they don't have the means to pay for that. They don't have the means because they have so little that they're on Medicaid. So it's their friends, it's their family that take on those additional expenses, that take on those quality of life items that you would have wanted. Because the priority is keeping you in good quality care, having you have direct, control of that quality of care for as long as possible. And then if you need other things beyond what Medicaid provides, it's not your kids having to come up with the money or the resources for that each month. It's them being able to tap into the resources that you've already set aside and preserved from care costs. So that way, great example. You go on Medicaid, you have your nice room, you have your room that you like. And because the facility is a business, and again, Medicaid's going to pay less than private pay individuals, they may say, we're going to move you from that room that you like into this shared room. And even if that roommate is a nice person, you may not want a roommate at that point. So since the facility is a business, your family could choose to say, well, how much does it cost per month to keep my mom or dad in that room that they like? And the facility would say, well, that's $100 or $200 a month, whatever that is. That's not your kids having to come up with $100 or $200 a month. That's your kids being able to tap into the money that you've set aside, that you've trusted them with managing, and choosing to spend it on those additional needs. So even if everything that was preserved was spent, it's spent at their discretion to keep you receiving good quality care. A really common, unfortunate thing that we see too is because of these lower Medicaid rates, because of these private pay requirements, some facilities don't take Medicaid. And some facilities have decided to stop taking Medicaid, which is the problem. If you pay, completely spend down until the point that you're on Medicaid at facility 1, and your care needs change, something with that facility changes, and you need a different facility, that second facility is not going to honor the private pay requirements of facility 1. So if you needed to meet a new private pay requirement and you've already spent down to the point that you're on Medicaid, that is where that can become very difficult to meet a new private pay requirement at a facility you would like to be at, that facility 2. It's about preserving your choice and control of things for as long as possible. And if you're in a position with dementia or Alzheimer's where you're not understanding or to make these decisions, it's about who do you trust to take care of that for you? Who would do the right thing and spend your money appropriately, and then manage everything correctly. So that's often where I talk through with clients. Do you have necessary things like powers of attorney? Do you have your estate plan in place? Who are those people that you trust to help get this planning in place if you're in a situation where you can't do that for yourself, but you would have liked your family to have the option to preserve things, have that money available to supplement you, and ultimately that money that you preserve is protected from that estate recovery component as well. So I definitely have more things to talk about with this topic, but I would encourage you, again, if you're attending and you have questions, there is that Q&A feature. Medicaid planning can feel like a lot, and that's just because it is. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer, and I will just give that a couple of seconds here. Okay, well, I won't pause for too long, and if a question comes in, I will loop back to it. But another thing that I wanted to talk about with Medicaid and the idea of spend down is, well, how does that work? What are you talking about? Where does that get preserved? And to create better control, to have better taxes, all those good things, I'm talking about a type of trust. So different from maybe trusts that you might be familiar with, revocable living trust, something that you're in charge of. The type of trust that I'm talking about is a trust that's better if you're not in charge, an irrevocable trust, and drafting the irrevocable trust around Medicaid concerns. So we just refer to that as a Medicaid irrevocable trust. And I see the question, I'll finish this thought and jump back to it. So a Medicaid irrevocable trust is a type of trust that's written to say that the things within the trust are not part of that, countable or non-countable for your assets. Now, they still are divestments. So when you move items into this type of trust, it's still a divestment. And what that means is you can't just give everything that you own overnight to your family or to whoever, say that you have no money, and then ask the government to pay for your care. It's about creating that planning within that penalty period, which is a penalty in terms of time for what you've given away. So the best long-term care planning is prospective planning, but we still have the option to be able to do emergency planning if you have good powers of attorney, which is something if you don't have or don't know, that's something we can always review with you. The question is from Jeff, is it possible to reduce or avoid the estate recovery aspect? That's a good question. So exactly the trust that I'm talking about, Jeff, this irrevocable trust, anything that's within that trust at the point that, that person passes away, even if they access Medicaid, they're non-recoverable. So we eliminate whatever that estate recovery concern is for the items that are within that trust. So that's one way that we avoid that estate recovery. There are other things that people talk about. Life estate deeds. Life estate deeds were a very common plan to plan around long-term care expenses for your home. They are no longer good planning when it comes to that estate recovery component. They were never great tax planning, but as of August 1st, 2014, that life estate interest is recoverable for that estate recovery component. So life estates were something that people did where it's the idea of you kind of give a portion of your house to your kids. It's called a remainderment interest. And that remainderment interest grows with time as you get older. So the one thing that I think surprises people about life estates is you truly own a good chunk of your home, even at 99 years old. So there's still a good portion that's considered yours as part of that life estate. And then your portion of that life estate is recoverable as of August 1st, 2014. So sometimes I see, unfortunately, those life estates done in the past couple of years or really any year after that point. And there's planning that we can do to help protect that portion of it. But unfortunately, it's just not great long-term care planning there. Other ways to avoid the estate recovery aspect. We talked about life estates, doing trust. The other thing people do, which they should not do, is typically outright gifting. And there are not a lot of absolutes in long-term care planning. You limit yourself when there are. But from a perspective of control and frequently a perspective of taxes, outright gifting to your kids is not a good idea. The reason is because when you gift something to someone, so common example, when mom and dad take their home and they gift it to their kids, they're doing that because they're trying to get it outside of that 5-year look back for Medicaid. They're trying to say, this is no longer something that I own. My kids own it. There is no bigger loss of control for you than that. You're taking something that you own and now someone else is owning it. So without any sort of other agreement in place, and there are other agreements that you can do, but while it might be ethically awful for your kids to then sell your home and take that money or charge you rent or evict you, that might be ethically a bad thing. It's not legally a bad thing. And we all have good kids until we don't. So that is the biggest loss of control that you have, is by taking something that you own and giving it to someone else. And even if those kids are all good kids, say that example of you have 4 kids, you put the home in the 4 kids' names. Now you are opening your personal residence up to the liability of your 4 kids. So even if you're able to get past the 5 years for Medicaid, whatever happens to your kids happens to that property. So good example of this. We had many years ago, people come in, and we hadn't done this planning, but the problem was that 20 years before this, mom and dad had put their house into the 4 kids' names. I don't even remember if they ever needed care. They were well beyond the 5-year look back. But the problem was, in those intervening 20 years, 2 of their 4 kids had died. So 1/4 of the house went according to that child's estate plan, which when she passed away, it went to their son-in-law, which I don't think was their intent, but it's not a problem. He's a decent enough guy. The problem was, one of their other daughters had also passed, and she was a single mom. So her share went to her son. And at the time, mom and dad or grandparents were doing this planning, that child was 5 years old. He is now 25 and with a major substance abuse problem. And the problem is, it is now time to sell this house, and he owns 1/4 of it. They came in not because they didn't want to have him benefit from that 1/4. They came in because they didn't want to cause harm to him with selling the house and giving him 1/4 of the proceeds, because he has a substance abuse problem. And the difficulty is, with the way it was just gifted, he owns 1/4 of that house. There's really nothing that anyone can do. And unless he willingly gives it up, which he wasn't in a position to do, he owns 1/4 of that house. If it's sold, he gets 1/4 of the proceeds. So liability is a problem. It's also bad tax planning. So just to kind of roughly explain, like capital gains and cost basis, and this is a really high level overview because I only have a couple more minutes. Real estate, stocks, these are things subject to capital gains taxes typically. Capital gains just means that when you buy your home, you have what's called a cost basis, which is the IRS basically saying how much you bought your home for. And then when you go to sell it, if there's a gain, so you sell it for more than you bought it, which is typical with real estate, that you pay anywhere from a 15 to 20% tax on that difference. Now, for most people, when they sell their primary home, they don't pay any capital gains. The reason is because we all have a great 121 exclusion from capital gains. It's a $250,000 coupon per person, where it says for your primary residence, where you've lived the past 2 out of 5 years, you get that coupon, that $250,000 of gain forgiven. Married couple, you double that. The problem is, if you gift the house to someone, your cost basis shifts to them. Their cost basis is whatever you purchased it for. Now, when you inherit property, what happens is the IRS revalues that cost basis as of the date of that death. So if you pass away and your home is left to your kids as part of your plan, and they sell it close in time to when they receive it, they never pay any taxes on that money because it gets revalued. Now, when you gift the home to the kids, your cost basis again transfers. And that means at the point that your kids sell it, because it's not their primary residence, they will pay an instant, 15 to 20% tax on that difference that otherwise could have been wiped out if it was just something that they received as part of the inheritance. And the irrevocable trust that I was talking about would fix all those things. It fixes the control point because you can hire and fire your trustees, fixes the taxes point, and also just the general liabilities. Your trustees are more like managers. If something happens to them, it doesn't impact your trust. So I think, Jeff, that's how I can kind of best answer reducing or avoiding the estate recovery aspect is, I'll click answered live, is to, talk with an experienced elder law attorney about how best to do that. I'm not saying gifting is always bad. Depends on what your power of attorney is able to do, which again, very important to have your powers of attorney reviewed. So that way you can make sure you can do long-term care planning. And then most frequently when we're thinking taxes, we're thinking control, you're going to be better suited by using that irrevocable trust rather than outright gifting. It's just more of a risk there. And that 15 to 20% tax as well. Even if you can get it outside of the Medicaid point with the state recovery, it's a taxation issue. So were there any other questions? Anything anyone else is wondering about Medicaid planning and again, too, if you have questions, if you want to get your powers of attorney reviewed, you're not really sure where to start, we offer those 2-hour complimentary initial consultations. Happy to talk through what your goals and questions are and provide that knowledge to you. So I don't think there's anything else I wanted to cover today. That ended up being a great question, Jeff, because it looped me into all sorts of things I wanted to talk about. So, okay, if there aren't any other questions, I can go ahead and let you guys get back to your afternoon, your kind of rainy and cold afternoon, but we should be all set. So thank you so much. Materials will be emailed out to you, and have a good rest of your day.